Story 2. Echoes Beneath the Ridge. I had chosen to camp near the ridge on a whim, the kind of place hikers are usually warned to avoid, though I didn't pay much mind to local tales. The path leading up was rough, overgrown in spots, and the trees grew denser as I ascended. The ridge jutted sharply from the surrounding slopes, offering a view that stretched across miles of Blue Ridge forest, but it carried a sense of isolation unlike any other spot I had ever been to. The sun was just slipping behind distant peaks when I pitched my tent on a small, flat stretch of ground. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp pine and the faint tang of soil, and at first the sounds of the ridge were soothing, leaves rustling in the breeze. The distant chatter of a creek, the occasional call of a bird settling in for night. I felt a rare peace, as if I'd discovered a corner of the world entirely my own. I spent the evening tending a small fire, the flames crackling softly, throwing flickering light against the canvas of my tent. I ate in silence, listening to the natural orchestra of wind through the trees and the faint movement of animals preparing for night. But as midnight drew near, something shifted. The sounds that had been comforting began to layer with another, softer, subtler sound. Low murmurs like voices, too faint at first to make sense of. I froze mid-bite, straining to listen, telling myself it was just the wind playing tricks on the leaves or a distant animal moving through underbrush. But the tone of the murmurs was wrong. There was a sense of intent in them, an urgency, almost fear. And though I could not make out any words, they carried the weight of something alive, something aware of me. My pulse quickened, and I unzipped the tent slowly, peering out into the night with my flashlight in hand. The beam cut through the blackness, illuminating the swaying trees, the uneven ground, the scattered rocks of the ridge. I called out softly, hoping to catch whatever animal or wanderer might have been nearby, but my voice dissolved into the darkness. Nothing moved, just the trees swaying without pattern, without rhythm, yet the whispers continued. They seemed to shift in space, sometimes close enough to feel as though they brushed against the canvas of my tent, sometimes distant, only to return with sudden immediacy. I walked slowly around my campsite, flashlight trembling, every snapped twig underfoot sounding like a gunshot in the still night. And yet I saw nothing. Returning to the tent, I felt a tightening in my chest, a nervous energy I couldn't shake. The whispers had not ceased. They were now circling me, moving in ways that made no sense. Voices I could not locate, but whose presence I could not ignore. I sat on the ground just outside my tent, hugging my knees, listening, trying to reason that perhaps this was a trick of sound on the ridge, echoes from some distant valley, or wind funneling through the trees in strange ways. But the cadence, the tone, the insistence of the murmurs felt deliberate, as if the ridge itself were speaking, or something within it. There was a subtle pattern, a rhythm I could not fully grasp, that sent shivers down my spine with each repetition. I thought of leaving, of packing up in the dark and retreating down the ridge, but the fear of moving blindly through the forest kept me rooted. Every instinct told me to flee, yet every muscle protested at the thought of stepping into the unseen. I remained crouched in the small patch of light from my flashlight, watching, listening, feeling that something was observing my hesitation, studying me in the darkness. The shadows among the trees seemed thicker than they should have been, dense shapes that did not belong to any ordinary foliage. The whispers seemed to respond to my heartbeat, rising and falling as I inhaled and exhaled, creating an intimate awareness I could not shake. Hours passed in a slow, distorted blur. I lost track of time, marking minutes only by the moments when the whispers paused, giving me a brief reprieve before returning with greater intensity. Each pause left me holding my breath, fearing the continuation, and when the murmurs resumed, they seemed to crawl closer, circling the tent as if assessing, judging, or perhaps testing. At one point, I dared to peek beyond my small circle of flashlight light and saw what I swore were vague silhouettes slipping between the trees, but the darkness was absolute, and when I blinked, they were gone. Still, I could feel them, something moving just beyond perception, always just out of reach, always aware of me. The night stretched onward with no relief. The ridge, which had felt like a secluded sanctuary in the daylight, became a labyrinth of tension and dread. My body ached, and my mind spun between rationalization and terror. I tried to remember that this was a remote forest, empty of human presence, that perhaps the whispers were echoes of animals, the wind, my own exhaustion speaking back to me in a cruel mimicry. Yet the sense of intelligence, of purpose in the murmurs, refused to be dismissed. It was not imagination. It was something there, and it was waiting. I could feel its attention as clearly as the weight of the pack on my back or the chill in the night air. As the first grey light of dawn began to edge over the horizon, the whispers faded, leaving only the normal creaks and sighs of the forest waking. My relief was muted by exhaustion and a lingering tension, the ridge now returning to its quiet normalcy, as though nothing had occurred. I packed up slowly, each movement deliberate, reluctant to leave, but fearful to remain. The forest was patient, it seemed, silent once more, yet I knew the truth. I had heard voices, and something had been beneath the ridge, moving, listening, waiting. I could not explain it, could not rationalize it away, and the memory clung to me like a second skin. I descended the ridge with a heightened awareness of every sound, every shadow. Even in the daylight, the trees seemed to lean closer, the angles of the forest sharper, the gaps between rocks and roots deeper. I felt as though I carried the whispers with me, the memory of them etched into my consciousness. Every small noise, the snap of a twig, a gust of wind, the distant call of a bird, rekindled the sense of being followed, of being measured, evaluated. And though the ridge had been abandoned, I could not shake the feeling that it was alive with unseen watchers. Weeks later, I would tell friends about the ridge, downplaying what I had heard, attributing it to fatigue, wind, or my imagination. But the memory remained precise in its terror. I could close my eyes and hear the murmurs again, low and urgent, circling, persistent, indifferent to explanation. The experience had altered my sense of isolation, of how I move through the mountains, of how the forest itself can seem to respond to those who wander too far into its folds. I returned to more familiar trails later, but the memory of the ridge stayed with me, a quiet, gnawing presence. Some nights, when the wind rustles the leaves just right and the house is still, I swear I hear the same murmurs, faint, insistent, warning me, reminding me that the ridge waits, patient and unyielding. I have never camped there again, nor will I, but I can still feel it, the subtle, unnerving knowledge that whatever I encountered beneath the ridge was real, and whatever it was, it is still there, somewhere, waiting for the next person foolish enough to wander into its quiet, listening darkness. Story 3. The Forgotten Cemetery. Whispers. I remember the day I stumbled across that forgotten cemetery as if it were etched into my memory in sharper relief than the world around it. I had been hiking alone through a remote section of the Blue Ridge, following a trail that locals had warned me was little more than a deer path, overgrown and nearly lost to the forest. The day had been unusually foggy, the kind of damp, rolling mist that muffles sound and makes the trees seem taller, darker, heavier. I'd been hiking for hours, legs sore, pack straining my shoulders when I came upon the clearing. It was small, barely more than a dip in the ridge, and there, half swallowed by the undergrowth, was the cemetery. The stones were ancient, worn almost smooth by decades of rain and wind, some tilted at impossible angles, their inscriptions long since faded. The air was colder here, the fog thicker, and I felt an odd tug of both curiosity and unease. I set my pack down and rested on a fallen stone, the wood damp and rough against my palms. The silence was complete at first, a quiet so dense that even the faint creak of leaves felt loud. Then, subtle at first, I thought it might be the wind, or perhaps birds shifting in the fog. I heard them, faint murmurs, soft, almost rhythmic, drifting through the mist. I looked around, expecting to see another hiker, a hunter, someone else passing through, but the clearing was empty. The murmurs didn't rise and fall like natural sounds. They lingered, persistent, wrapping around the fog, moving in ways that made no sense. They were faint, but they carried a weight, a deliberate cadence that made my skin crawl. I tried to dismiss it as imagination, exhaustion playing tricks, but the words, or what I thought might be words, began to take shape. I couldn't understand them, though I strained to listen. The sounds were unlike any language I had ever heard, guttural and melodic at once, a cadence that felt older than the mountains themselves, as if the stones around me were speaking, or perhaps the fog itself. I felt a chill crawl down my spine, the kind that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand straight and prickled the skin on my arms. I tried to move, to stand, but it was as though the clearing had shifted. Paths I had followed to get here seemed narrower, twisted, lined by trees whose trunks leaned in a way that didn't feel natural. Every step I took felt heavier, the forest closing in, the fog thickening. I turned back, trying to find the trail that had brought me here, but the world seemed subtly changed. Branches that had not been in my path now barred the way. The ground dipped in unexpected places. The murmurs followed, drifting just beyond my hearing, circling, pressing. I felt eyes everywhere, though I could see nothing. A suffocating awareness that I was being watched, studied. I began to move faster, breaking through undergrowth, snapping twigs beneath my boots. But the whispers never stopped. At times, I thought I could hear faint, echoing footsteps behind me. Yet each time I turned, the forest was empty. The more I struggled to find the trail, the more disoriented I became. The fog was relentless, closing in until I could barely see my own hands in front of my face. Shapes flickered at the edge of my vision, twisting, moving shadows that vanished when I tried to focus on them. I felt my heart hammering, my breath short and uneven, the forest around me transforming from familiar terrain into something alive, something patient, something waiting. I stumbled repeatedly, catching myself on roots and rocks, but I could not stop. The murmurs seemed to grow in urgency, rising and falling in a rhythm that mimicked my own panic. After what felt like hours, though it could have been minutes, I broke through the last line of trees and stumbled onto a familiar part of the main trail. The fog thinned, the murmurs faded, and for the first time since I had entered that clearing, I felt as though I could breathe. The forest seemed normal again, the familiar sounds of birds and rustling leaves returning, yet the tone of the whispers lingered in my mind. They were not gone. I could still hear them faintly when I closed my eyes, repeating themselves in that strange, ungraspable language. Even in the sunlit day, the memory pressed down on me, heavier than any stone I had ever carried. That night, and the nights that followed, the whispers haunted my dreams. I would wake suddenly, convinced I could hear them through the walls of my home, faint murmurs curling around the edges of my hearing. Sleep was uneasy. Every shadow in my room seemed to shift, every creak of the house carrying the weight of unseen eyes. I tried to tell myself it had been the fog, my imagination, isolation weighing on a tired mind, but the detail, the rhythm, the deliberate cadence of those murmurs would not be dismissed. I remembered the tilt of the stones, the cold of the clearing, the way the air had felt almost alive, and I knew the memory was real. I have returned to the Blue Ridge many times since. Hiking trails I know, paths I trust. Yet I have never sought that clearing again. I avoid the ridge entirely, passing below it when I can, keeping my eyes low, my pace steady. But the memory clings. Even now, I can close my eyes and hear it. Faint whispers drifting through fog, carrying no words I can understand, but a feeling I cannot ignore. Something lingers in that cemetery, something patient and old, watching from between the stones, moving with the fog. I do not know what it is or why it calls out, but I know it is there, and I know that when I was caught in its presence, I felt entirely unprepared for what the mountains can hold. I try not to think about it too often, but the Blue Ridge has a way of embedding its memory into you, of making the past as tangible as the present. When I'm alone, the wind sometimes carries faint murmurs through the trees, and for a moment the world tilts again toward that forgotten clearing. I can feel the weight of the fog, hear the rhythm of the whispers echoing in my chest. I wonder if they are calling to me still, or if they simply exist beyond human comprehension, indifferent and eternal. That forgotten cemetery, overgrown and nearly invisible, holds a presence I cannot name or explain. I have walked many miles in the mountains, but I have never felt anything like that awareness, something watching, something waiting, something patient, as old as the ridge itself. I carry it with me, a quiet, gnawing knowledge that some places in the forest are alive in ways we cannot see, and that the whispers, once heard, never fully leave you. They cling in the fog, in the stones, in the spaces between the trees, and in the quiet moments when you think you are alone. Even now, I can hear them if I listen too closely, murmurs older than memory, carrying a weight that is almost unbearable. The experience has changed the way I move through the mountains. I walk with caution, I listen, I acknowledge that the forest may remember, that the fog may conceal, that silence is never empty. The clearing, the cemetery, the whispers, all of it lingers in my mind, a reminder that some parts of the Blue Ridge are not meant for human presence, that some spaces hold the echoes of something beyond comprehension. And though I have tried to forget, though I have tried to rationalize it, I know that the whispers, in some form, are still there, drifting through the fog, patient, waiting, a reminder of the mountain's quiet, unyielding watch. Story 4. The Hollow Road Murmurs. I was driving late that night down a narrow, nearly forgotten road in the Blue Ridge, the kind of place locals always warn you about but never tell you exactly why. The fog was thick, heavy enough that my headlights barely cut through it, casting long, trembling beams across slick asphalt and the dark, looming shapes of the forest. Mile after mile, it was just me and the smell of wet pine and damp earth, the occasional rustle of unseen animals moving through the underbrush. At first, it was peaceful in that way only isolation can be, quiet enough that you notice everything, the subtle noises of the world you normally ignore. Then I heard it, a faint whisper, almost like the wind sliding over the leaves. Too soft to be certain. At first I told myself it was my imagination, or maybe a trick of the fog, but the whispers persisted. I strained to listen, trying to rationalize them. The sound was unmistakably human, low and urgent, curling through the trees alongside me in a rhythm that seemed to match my own heartbeat. I slowed the car, trying to see if someone was walking the roadside, maybe a stranded traveler, but the fog was too thick. The forest looked empty, impenetrable, and the voices followed, growing louder and more insistent, almost pleading. I wanted to dismiss it, to tell myself I was alone, but the tone carried a desperation I couldn't ignore. It wasn't yelling, just calling, soft and deliberate, as if someone needed me to understand something they could not say clearly. I tried to speed up, hoping the distance would lessen the sound, but the whispers didn't fade. They seemed to stretch and twist with the road, bending around the trees, echoing in a way that made it impossible to tell their origin. Every time I glanced at the roadside, I half expected to see someone, anyone, standing just beyond the fog, watching, waiting. My hands gripped the wheel tighter, knuckles white, and my breath became shallow, uneven. The trees pressed closer to the road, shadows pooling in the beams of my headlights, and the whispers followed, circling, moving with me, patient and unrelenting. Eventually, fear overwhelmed curiosity. I pulled over to the side of the road, heart hammering, shaking so badly I couldn't even reach for my phone without fumbling. The whispers stopped the moment I came to a halt, leaving an almost tangible silence that pressed against my ears. For a few seconds, I thought I was safe. I thought maybe the road was just a road, the forest just a forest, and that the voices had been nothing more than a trick of my nerves. But then the silence itself felt heavy, unnatural, as though waiting for me to act, to move, to acknowledge something I could not see. I stayed in the car, hands on the wheel, listening to the empty night, trying to make sense of it. The fog was still thick, swallowing the road ahead, the rearview mirror reflecting nothing but darkness. I felt exposed, small, as if the trees themselves were leaning in, watching, waiting. I told myself to breathe, to calm my racing thoughts, but the stillness was maddening. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to get back on the road and drive until I could see the familiar lights of a town, but my feet felt leaden. The road was no longer just asphalt under tires. It had become a boundary between the ordinary and something I couldn't define. After what felt like an eternity, I gathered enough courage to start the car again. As I drove, the whispers did not return, but the memory of them lingered, curling around my mind, persistent and insistent. I could not shake the rhythm I had felt. The urgent tone, the sensation that someone, or something, had been following, not in a physical sense, but in a way that made the very air seem alive. Every shadow on the roadside, every flicker of light in the fog, felt like it belonged to that presence. When I finally approached a bend where the forest thinned slightly and the fog began to lift, I glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. There, among the trees lining the road, I saw a dark shape, tall, human-like, still, staring in my direction. It did not move, but I could feel its gaze, a cold, patient awareness that made my stomach knot. I blinked, thinking it might be a trick of the fog or my own terror, but when I looked again it was still there, watching, waiting. My pulse surged, and I forced my foot down on the accelerator, the engine roaring as I tried to put distance between myself and whatever I had glimpsed. The figure remained at the edge of my vision, receding slowly until the curve of the road finally swallowed it from sight. Even after that, long past the bend, long past the ridge where the road straightened and the trees thinned, I could feel the memory of it lingering. Every rustle of leaves, every shadow that caught my peripheral vision felt like a reminder. I could not shake the feeling that the forest had watched me that night, that something had moved with me, that the whispers were not idle noises, but a warning or a test. Sleep came fitfully for weeks afterward, haunted by faint murmurs and the sense of eyes just beyond the edges of vision. I have driven that road again during daylight, the same twists and curves now benign and ordinary, but the memory remains. The whispers never return, yet I hear them in the quiet of my mind, low, deliberate, insistent, circling, echoing in a rhythm I cannot forget. They are a reminder of that foggy night, the thick air of the Blue Ridge, the narrow road where the ordinary became something else entirely, something patient, something waiting, And though I have told myself 1,000 times that it was my imagination, that the combination of fog, isolation, and fatigue had conjured the voices and the shadow, I know, deep down, that it was real. That night, the forest spoke in its own way, and I was forced to listen. Even now, years later, when the wind rustles through trees and fog gathers low in the hollows, I remember the sound of those whispers. They are faint, almost imperceptible, but they echo in my memory as vividly as the first moment I heard them. A subtle rhythm, a tone of urgency, the unshakable sensation of being watched. I have avoided that road at night ever since, but the memory follows, lingering like a shadow I cannot outrun, a quiet dread that waits in the folds of the mountains. The Blue Ridge has a way of keeping its secrets, and the hollow road is one of them. Patient, silent, and alive in the way that only the oldest forests can be. Story 5. The Lantern Keeper's Secret. I had been following an old trail in the Blue Ridge that I'd stumbled across by accident, a narrow ribbon of dirt and roots winding between dense trees and moss-covered rocks. The sun had begun to dip low in the sky, the forest turning long and quiet shadows that stretched across the trail, and I was feeling that mix of fatigue and curiosity that comes when you wander far from the familiar. My footsteps were muffled by the damp soil, the occasional crunch of a twig underfoot breaking the heavy silence. That's when I saw it, a faint flickering light through the trees, dim but unmistakable, swaying gently as if caught in a slight breeze. I paused, heart ticking faster in the quiet, and tried to reason it out. Perhaps another hiker had a lantern, or someone had started a small campfire deep in the forest. But the light seemed too steady, too deliberate to be a fire, and I could see no figure, no movement among the shadows. Curiosity overpowered caution, and I stepped off the trail, pushing through the undergrowth toward the glow. The forest closed in around me, gnarled branches reaching overhead, the smell of wet pine and earth thick in the air. As I approached, the dim light resolved into a tiny clearing, almost like a pocket carved out of the trees, and in its center burned an old lantern, swinging gently though there was no breeze. The metal was rusted, the glass cloudy, but the flame burned steadily. A warm yellow-orange that seemed impossibly alive in the gloom. I froze, trying to make sense of it. There was no one near, no footprints in the damp soil, not even an impression in the leaves. And then I heard it, the whispers. They were soft at first, like the low hum of wind through branches, barely distinguishable, almost a trick of the mind. But as I stood there, listening, I realized the sound was not the wind at all. It was fragmented, broken into tiny murmurs that seemed to rise and fall in rhythm with the flickering flame. They weren't words, not in any language I recognized, just fragments of sound, soft syllables that brushed my ears and stirred a deep unease in my chest. My skin prickled, and I found myself unable to look away from the lantern. The longer I listened, the more I felt as if it was speaking directly to me, or perhaps through me. And then something even stranger happened. The whispers began to form. Images, impressions, memories. Not in words, not in clear sentences, but in a way that seemed to bypass my thoughts entirely. I felt flashes of my own life, intimate moments no one else could know, replaying like a film only I could see. The first time I understood what was happening, a shiver ran through me, the flame flickering as though in acknowledgement. There was no logic to it, no human hand guiding what I experienced, just the lantern, the clearing, and the whispers. I wanted to look away, to run back to the trail, but my body refused to obey. I was rooted to the spot, hypnotized, a silent witness to some secret I could not hope to grasp fully. Time lost all meaning. The light swung gently, the shadows of the surrounding trees shifting slowly, almost as if breathing. The whispers continued, soft fragments of sound that seemed to move around me in circles, brushing past my ears, tugging at memory, dredging up images I had never shared, names of childhood friends I had long forgotten, moments of solitude in places no one else had seen, private thoughts I had never voiced, all pressed against me in a way that felt alive, intimate, impossible. My heart thumped so hard I was certain it could be heard in the stillness. Fear, wonder, and awe tangled together in my chest, leaving me trembling and breathless. As the night deepened, I began to understand something fundamental. The lantern wasn't tied to a person. There was no keeper, no figure waiting in the shadows. The light, the whispers, the way the clearing seemed carved just for this moment, they were part of the land itself. The mountain, the forest, the clearing, they held memory, or perhaps consciousness, something older and patient, capable of drawing me in, of showing me what I had carried inside without my own awareness. And I, for all my curiosity and caution, had stumbled into its orbit. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. I could not tell. I sat on the mossy ground, legs folded beneath me, staring at the lantern and listening to the soft, insistent murmurs. I had long since lost any notion of being tired. The forest around me seemed quiet, yet alive, as if the trees themselves bent in toward the clearing, leaning closer to hear, to observe, to participate in the secret I was being shown. The light never wavered, the flames steady in a way that defied reason, and the whispers continued, a hypnotic rhythm that pulled me deeper, making me aware of my own life in ways that were uncomfortable, invasive, and strangely compelling. Eventually, the first pale edge of sunlight began to seep through the trees, brushing the clearing with a hesitant light. The lantern flickered once, twice, and then, as though obeying some unspoken command, it was gone. I blinked, and the clearing was empty, the moss and leaves undisturbed, the forest silent. The whispers had vanished along with the flame, leaving only a faint echo in my mind, a memory of sounds and sensations that I could not fully grasp or explain. I stood, legs shaky, trying to reconcile what had occurred with the ordinary world around me. The trail was still there, winding back through the trees as it always had been, but everything about it felt altered, charged with the memory of something ancient and aware. I walked back slowly, almost unwilling to leave the clearing, haunted by the realization that I had experienced something beyond comprehension. The whispers had not been tied to a person or a human presence. They were part of the land itself, something that had existed long before I was born and would continue long after I was gone. It was patient, observant, almost sentient in its own quiet way. I tried to speak aloud, to rationalize, but my voice sounded hollow in the thick morning air. There was no one to answer, no explanation to be found, only the quiet, eternal forest surrounding me. Even now, weeks later, I can close my eyes and hear them, the soft, fragmented murmurs, the rhythm that matches my own heartbeat, the sense of being observed by something older than memory. I remember the warmth of the lantern, the hypnotic flicker of its flame, the sensation of the forest pressing in, and I know it was real. Not imagination, not fatigue, not a trick of the mind. Something in that clearing was alive in a way I cannot describe, holding memory, holding life, holding me in a way I will never forget. I have returned to the Blue Ridge since then, but I have avoided that trail, that clearing, that lantern. I do not seek it, and yet the memory lingers, a quiet, insistent presence at the edge of thought. Some nights, when the wind rustles the trees just right, I can hear faint murmurs again, like a memory of that night brushing against me. and though I have tried to move past it, tried to rationalize it into ordinary terms, I know the truth. The forest remembers, and the clearing. The lantern and its whispers are part of that remembrance. It is patient, it is aware, and it waits. Story 6. The Hollow Trees Lament. I had passed the hollow oak countless times on my hikes, the same massive tree standing like a sentinel along the ridge trail, gnarled and ancient, its branches twisting into the sky like arthritic fingers. I never paid it much mind. It was impressive, sure, but nothing out of the ordinary. That evening, though, the forest felt heavier, darker, as if the sun's last light had been swallowed early by something unseen. The air hung thick, humid and still, and my boots sank slightly into the damp earth with each step. I should have noticed the quiet first. The birds had gone silent, the usual rustle of small animals absent. Instead, I heard a sound so soft at first I thought it was the wind, then realized it wasn't wind at all. The whispers began as I drew near the oak. At first they were so faint, so almost imperceptible, that I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. But the closer I got, the more distinct they became. Low, urgent, sorrowful, curling around me in a rhythm that matched the quickening of my own heartbeat. I paused, glancing over my shoulder into the thickening forest, expecting some hiker or camper to be nearby. Nothing moved, nothing breathed, and yet the whispers continued, carrying a strange familiarity, as though the tree itself were aware of me and my presence. Hesitantly, I approached the hollow trunk. The opening was large enough to peer inside, and the shadows within seemed to shift subtly, like tiny shapes moving just out of clear view. My chest tightened as I stared, heart hammering against my ribs. The voices grew slightly louder, forming fragments that pressed against my ears and my mind. I could swear I heard my own thoughts, murmurs of fears and regrets I had never spoken aloud, scattered syllables echoing my private doubts. A shiver ran down my spine, the kind that makes the hair on the back of your neck rise and your limbs go suddenly cold. I wanted to back away, to step off the trail and leave the forest, but I couldn't move. My eyes stayed fixed on the hollow, drawn to something I couldn't name. The murmurs grew insistent, circling me, pressing closer. The shapes inside the hollow seemed to shift faster now, not enough to define, but enough to make my mind fill the void with possibilities. Tiny hands, faces, movements too quick to discern. Panic began to set in. My rational mind screamed that this was impossible, that I was exhausted from the hike, that fatigue and imagination had conjured the shapes and voices, but a deeper, more primal part of me knew otherwise. I tore my gaze from the hollow and bolted, sprinting down the trail, branches slapping against my arms, roots threatening to trip me with every step. Even as I ran, the whispers followed. They threaded through the trees, echoed off trunks and rocks, rolling through the undergrowth with a persistent sorrow that seemed almost alive. I could hear fragments of my own inner thoughts, my failures, my hesitations, my regrets, all repeated in that low, mournful tone. Every tree I passed seemed to hold the echo, every shadow twisting in a way that suggested a presence just beyond sight. I ran faster, lungs burning, limbs aching, but the lament chased me, patient and persistent, indifferent to distance. Eventually, the forest thinned, and I stumbled onto a wider, familiar section of trail. The whispers faded slightly, becoming distant murmurs that the wind carried away, but the memory of their tone, the sorrow, the urgency remained in my chest, a weight I could not shake. I sat on a rock at the edge of the trail, gasping, trying to reconcile what I had experienced with reality. The hollow oak loomed behind me, distant but unmistakable, its presence like a wound in the forest itself. Even from this distance I could feel the weight of it, the quiet watchfulness that seemed embedded into the very air. I have returned to the ridge many times since, and I've seen the hollow oak countless times more, but I have never dared approach it again at dusk or in fading light. Its silhouette against the horizon is just a tree to most, but to me it is a reminder of something patient and knowing, something that observes and waits, that hears and remembers. Sometimes, when the wind rustles through the leaves in just the right way, I catch fragments of that lament, whispers that brush against the edge of my consciousness. The rhythm, the tone, the sorrowful insistence, it is unmistakable. Even now, years later, I can close my eyes and feel the presence of that tree. I can hear the faint echoes of whispers carrying my own unspoken thoughts, as if the hollow still holds something inside, something that watches and remembers every passerby. The forest around it is unchanged, yet I know that part of it, the hollow oak, is alive in a way that is not biological, not ordinary. It is awareness, patience, sorrow, a quiet lament that will outlast me, lingering in the folds of the mountains. No one else knows of what I experienced, and I am not sure I would tell them if they did. Words fail to capture it. Rational explanations fall flat. I know what I heard and what I felt, and I know it was real. The hollow oak stands as it always has, ancient and unmoving, yet alive with something far older than memory. Its voices are patient, its lament ongoing, and the knowledge that it continues to exist just beyond my reach is a quiet terror I carry with me, one that returns each time the wind whispers through the leaves. Even the thought of passing that trail again fills me with unease. I know the hollow will be there, waiting, listening, reciting fragments of my inner self back to me. I try to focus on other paths, other parts of the ridge, but the memory of that night, of the voices and the hollow shapes shifting just out of sight, is indelible. It has become part of me, a lingering fear and fascination intertwined, a reminder that the mountains hold secrets far older than human understanding. The hollow oak is patient, the whispers continue, and I, despite my distance and caution, cannot escape the knowledge of its presence. Every rustle, every shadow, every soft groan of the forest carries the possibility of its lament, a reminder that some parts of the Blue Ridge are alive in ways that do not require eyes to see or mouths to speak. The hollow oak speaks in its own time, and even now I hear it in fragments. Echoes of the lament that have haunted me for years, soft, sorrowful, inescapable. Story 7, Whispers by the Mountain Stream. I had chosen a quiet spot beside a small, rushing mountain stream to set up camp, thinking the gentle gurgle of water over rocks would soothe me after a long day of hiking through the Blue Ridge. The sun was dipping low, leaving long shadows between the trees, and the air smelled of wet moss and pine. I pitched my tent on a narrow, flat patch of earth just above the bank, where the water flowed swiftly but calmly enough to lull the mind. As night approached, I built a small fire, letting the warm glow dance on the surrounding trees, and listened to the stream, expecting nothing more than the ordinary sounds of the forest. At first, everything seemed peaceful. The stream whispered over stones. The wind stirred the trees, and the occasional rustle of a night creature passed unnoticed. But as darkness thickened, I began to hear something else beneath the water's murmur. A soft, almost indistinguishable sound, faint but undeniably human. I paused, holding my breath, telling myself it was a trick of the wind, the water moving over the rocks, or perhaps my own mind straining in the solitude, yet the sound persisted, a low, pleading murmur that seemed to come from beneath the surface, curling around the stones and rushing downstream. Curiosity edged into unease, and I leaned closer to the water, straining to understand. The ripples glimmered in the firelight, but the shadows within seemed thicker, darker. almost as if the water itself held some secret just out of reach. And then I recognized the words, phrases I had spoken aloud earlier that day, during breaks on the trail or while talking to myself as I navigated difficult terrain, repeated in that soft, urgent tone. My stomach twisted and the fire seemed to dim, though the night air remained unchanged. The stream wasn't just moving water, it was speaking back to me, echoing my thoughts, my words, fragments of my own private mind. I stumbled backward, heart hammering, scrambling to put distance between myself and the water. My eyes darted over the stream, and I saw the reflections deepen unnaturally, shadows shifting that should not have been there. Shapes that were darker than the night itself flickered beneath the surface, moving against the current in ways no stone or leaf could account for. Panic set in, my breath ragged, and the fire's glow seemed fragile and insufficient against the growing dark. Every instinct screamed to run, yet the stream's whispers followed me, carrying my own words, my own thoughts, in a way that was intimate and horrifying. I grabbed my pack and bolted into the forest, scrambling over roots and rocks, branches tearing at my sleeves and hair. The stream ran parallel for a while, and though I tried to put distance between us, the murmurs persisted, carried on the night air as if the water itself were pursuing me. Each repetition of my words made the forest feel alive, aware, as if every shadow held unseen witnesses, every rustle and crack in the underbrush a reminder of eyes that had not blinked. My pulse hammered in my ears, matching the rhythm of the whispers, and for a long stretch I could not tell whether the voices were coming from the water, the trees, or inside my own mind. Eventually, the forest opened slightly, and I found the main trail, familiar and ordinary by daylight, but alien under the black sky. I slowed, gasping for air, trying to calm myself, yet I could still hear the faint echoes of my own words riding on the wind. The stream had receded behind me, or at least it appeared so, yet the murmurs lingered. A subtle insistence that followed me as I navigated the path back toward more travelled areas. My legs shook with adrenaline, my mind racing, replaying the sensation of being so intimately observed, so unnervingly mirrored by something I could not see or understand. By the time I emerged onto a larger, sunlit section of trail, the whispers faded into memory, leaving only a residue of unease in my chest. The mountains around me were quiet again, the trees rustling naturally, the streams and brooks ordinary in their motion. Yet I knew what I had experienced was not imagination, not fatigue, not the trick of night and isolation. The voices, the shadows beneath the water, the way the stream had repeated my words as though listening and remembering, all of it was real. The mountains, the forest, and the water had acknowledged my presence in a way that left me small, watched, and profoundly unsettled. Even now, years later, whenever I hike near streams or listen to water gurgling over rocks, I catch fragments of those whispers in my memory. They are soft, pleading, familiar, yet alien, carrying the weight of something that knows me more intimately than I know myself. The mountains hold their secrets patiently, and the streams carry memories not meant for human ears. I can still feel the invisible gaze of those waters, the echoes of that night, as if the mountains themselves remembered, as if they waited silently for the next hiker foolish enough to listen. Story 8. Nightfall at Ravens Peak. I had chosen to camp near Ravens Peak because I'd heard the view at sunset was unlike anything else in the Blue Ridge. The climb had been steep, exhausting, but when I finally reached the small clearing where I set my tent, the valley stretched below me like a patchwork quilt of trees and fog. The sun hung low, spilling orange and gold over the ridgelines, and for a while I let myself be consumed by the beauty, the quiet satisfaction of having made it this far alone. The air smelled of damp pine and fallen leaves, and I thought the night would be like so many others, peaceful, uneventful, and restful. As darkness settled, though, the stillness of the mountains shifted. At first it was subtle, almost imperceptible, a faint susurration that seemed to come from nowhere in particular. I told myself it was the wind through the rocks, or the subtle shifting of trees settling in the night, and I tried to ignore it. But the sound persisted, soft, almost melodic, and tinged with something I could not name, a cautionary undertone that pricked at the back of my neck. The whispers seemed to come from every direction, the wind brushing against the rocks, the ground beneath my feet, even the air itself vibrating with a quiet insistence. I strained to hear, trying to convince myself it was my imagination, but the voices were deliberate, weaving together fragments of my own thoughts, my worries about my job, the arguments I'd had earlier in the week, memories I hadn't even spoken aloud. It was as if the mountain had taken my mind and reflected it back, softly, patiently, in a way that made me deeply uncomfortable. My chest tightened, and I felt a creeping dread I could not rationalize. The rhythmic quality of the whispers pressed against my ears, curling around my thoughts like a living thing. I could not tell whether they were inside my mind or emanating from the night itself. I tried to distract myself, telling myself to stay calm, to enjoy the solitude, to remember that I had camped alone in similar places countless times without incident. But the whispers grew louder, more insistent, and the fragments of thought they repeated were increasingly personal, as though the mountains were reading my fears and exposing them, reshaping them into audible fragments that brushed against my consciousness. I could hear my own insecurities repeated in a strange, sorrowful cadence, mingling with the natural sounds of the night until I could no longer tell what was real and what was projection. The darkness pressed in around me. Shadows shifted among the rocks and trees, subtle movements at the edges of vision that I could not clearly define. Each time I turned my head, the motion would vanish, leaving only the stillness of the forest. But the whispers persisted, curling through the clearing like smoke. The air grew cooler, thicker, and I felt a compulsion to move, to put distance between myself and the mountain, though my rational mind argued that I was overreacting, that I had simply been startled by the isolation and the weight of dusk. Finally, unable to bear the oppressive presence any longer, I packed what I could carry quickly and stepped down the narrow trail into the darkness. The forest around me seemed alive in new ways. Each root, each protruding rock became a potential hazard. The rustle of leaves sounded like movement just beyond my peripheral vision, and all the while the whispers followed, threading through the wind, echoing from the rocks and the ground, mirroring my thoughts in a way that was intimate and terrifying. The pace of my footsteps quickened, my breaths shallow and rapid, and I stumbled several times, scraping my knees and hands on jagged stones. Despite my effort to leave, the whispers did not relent. Each fragment of my thoughts repeated back to me with growing clarity and urgency, as if the mountain itself were aware of my attempts to escape, mocking me, warning me, reminding me that it remembered. Every shadow along the trail seemed a potential observer, every distant rustle a reminder that the night held witnesses I could not see. I could feel my pulse in my ears, matching the rhythm of the voices, and the forest felt both immense and intimate, a place where nothing escaped observation, nothing went unremembered. It took what felt like hours to reach the edge of the clearing where I had parked, my body trembling, muscles sore from the scramble down the rocky slope. Only when I saw the car, its metal glinting faintly in the moonlight, did I feel a temporary reprieve, though the whispers had not completely faded. They lingered faintly, a ghostly echo in my mind. I slid behind the wheel, locking the doors, hands shaking, trying to convince myself that it was over. Yet the memory of the night clung to me, the soft, melodic caution of the voices, the sense of being seen and read, the oppressive awareness of the mountain. Even now, years later, whenever the wind rushes through the trees in the Blue Ridge or brushes against the rocks at night, I hear faint fragments of those whispers. They are never fully coherent, but I recognize their rhythm and tone, the way they press against thought and memory. The mountains, the rocks, the very earth of Raven's Peak seem to hold on to what passes through them, remembering everything and everyone who comes near. I know that the night I spent there was not a hallucination, not a trick of exhaustion, not merely the sound of wind in the trees. Something in the mountains listens, and it remembers. The experience has changed how I move through the backcountry. I am cautious now, not just of the physical dangers, but of the presence lingering in places that appear silent and empty. I feel the weight of the unseen witnesses in every shadow, every rustle, every subtle sound that does not belong to any animal I can identify. Even on familiar trails, when the air shifts just right, I can catch a hint of the voices, as though Raven's Peak and the surrounding ridges are quietly observing, holding fragments of those who pass, the echoes of their fears and thoughts pressed into the folds of the mountains. I have not returned to that particular clearing, and I never will. But the memory, the whispers, and the weight of being watched by something so patient and pervasive linger. They are a quiet terror, persistent and subtle, always at the edge of awareness, a reminder that the Blue Ridge is older than I am, and it carries the memories of every soul who crosses its slopes. The wind, the rocks, the ground, they speak in a way I cannot fully comprehend, and when the night falls just right, I hear the voices again, faint, insistent, and intimately aware. Story 1. The Cabin at Widow's Hollow. I remember the first night I spent in Widow's Hollow like it was yesterday, though I've tried to push the memory deep into some forgotten corner of my mind. I'd been hiking alone through the Blue Ridge for most of the day, the trail growing thinner and more tangled as the sun sank lower, turning the forest into a tangle of orange shadows and whispered winds. My legs were sore, my pack unbearably heavy, and I knew I wouldn't make it back to the main road before dark. That's when I stumbled upon it. A small, abandoned cabin tucked beneath gnarled trees, their twisted limbs clawing at the sky like desperate hands. At first, the place seemed almost welcoming. The cabin was battered. The wood weathered and darkened by years of rain and wind, the roof sagging, windows cracked. Yet the hollow doorway gave a strange sense of shelter. The silence around it was thick, heavy, almost as if the forest itself had paused to watch me. I was desperate, so I pushed the door open and stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under my weight, dust rising like tiny spectres in the fading light. I settled against the wall near the fireplace, trying to convince myself that nothing would happen, that it was just an empty building, abandoned long ago. I unpacked my bag, trying to get comfortable, but the air inside felt off. It smelled of damp wood, mold, and something else I couldn't place, something metallic, faint, lingering. I tried to ignore it and focus on making a small fire with the dry kindling I found, but even as the flames sputtered to life, the silence of the cabin pressed on me. It wasn't a comfortable quiet, the kind you might find in a remote cabin on a peaceful evening. This quiet had weight. It seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something, or someone. By the time darkness fully claimed the hollow, the first whispers began. I thought at first it was just the wind slipping through the broken windows, a familiar sound to any hiker in the mountains, but then I realized the whispers carried words, my words, or at least words I recognized, as though spoken from the shadows themselves. "James," they murmured, soft and deliberate. I froze. My name. uttered in a tone that made the hairs on my neck stand on end. I told myself it was impossible, that no one could know I was here, that the forest was empty, yet the whispers grew louder with each passing minute. They weren't continuous. They came in measured, deliberate bursts, almost like someone pacing, stopping, speaking, then moving again. Every time I tried to dismiss them, to rationalize the sounds as wind or animals, the whispers shaped themselves into fragments of sentences I couldn't understand, strung together in a cadence that felt deliberate and knowing. The shadows inside the cabin seemed to shift with the words. At first, it was nothing more than the flicker of the fire-casting shapes on the walls. But soon I noticed movements that didn't match the firelight, shapes at the edge of my vision, moving just out of reach. I would turn, expecting to see the tree limbs casting trickery on the wood, but nothing was there. And yet, the sensation of being watched, of being followed within that tiny space, grew unbearable. I wanted to leave, to run out into the night, but the forest outside seemed somehow darker, more threatening than the cabin itself, and something inside told me it wouldn't let me go. So I stayed, huddled near the hearth, trying to convince myself that I was imagining everything, that exhaustion and hunger had twisted my perception. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. Time seemed distorted. The whispers became clearer, sharper. Though still incomprehensible, I could make out certain tones: urgency, insistence, sadness. At one point it sounded as if they were repeating my own thoughts, the fears I had carried silently through the day, the doubts I never voiced. My hands shook as I tried to build a stronger fire, the sound of each crackling log deafening in the otherwise oppressive silence. I wanted to speak, to call out to whatever, or whoever, was whispering, but my throat felt dry and tight, and the fear rooted me in place. The shadows continued to move along the walls, sometimes coalescing into forms that resembled people, or maybe memories of people, before dissolving again into darkness. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, yet the idea of stepping out into the forest, where those whispers might follow me or worse, seemed equally terrifying. By the time I forced myself to crawl into the small cot I found in one corner, the whispers had become almost rhythmic, like breathing in unison with my own. I lay there, eyes open, heart hammering, staring at the cracked ceiling as the sound wrapped around me. At one point, I heard a low, murmured sentence that made my stomach turn. It sounded like a warning, but the meaning eluded me. I felt trapped between the tangible reality of the cabin and something else, something older, patient, and watchful. Sleep eventually claimed me, fitful and shallow, punctuated by the sensation that a presence was standing just beyond the firelight, waiting for me to close my eyes completely. Morning broke slowly, spilling pale light through the broken windows. The whispers had ceased, leaving only the groan of the cabin settling in the cold air. I moved cautiously, almost afraid that the daylight would reveal the source of the voices, some living thing that had hidden all night. But the cabin was empty. The shadows were just shadows. The silence was simply silence. And yet, as I stepped outside and felt the sun on my face, I knew the experience was not a dream. Something in that hollow, in those walls, had been aware of me, had been watching, and perhaps waiting. The forest beyond seemed quiet in a way that was no comfort at all. It felt like a cage with invisible bars, the mountains closing in, holding on to a secret I had stumbled into uninvited. I never returned to Widow's Hollow, though I've driven past its outskirts on later hikes, too fearful of what might still dwell there. The memory of that night haunts me in small, unexpected ways. Sometimes, when I am alone and the wind stirs the leaves just so, I think I hear the faintest whisper of my name, deliberate and urgent, as though the cabin is calling me back, reminding me that it had chosen someone once, and that its vigilance is endless. I have told only a few friends about that night, downplaying the fear, the shapes, the whispers, but the truth lingers in my bones. The forest is not merely quiet, it listens, it waits. And Widow's Hollow, no matter how long ago I left it, remains alive in the memory of my own terror. A place where silence is not peace, and the walls themselves remember the living who dare enter. Even now, years later, the name of that hollow brings a tightening in my chest, a shiver I cannot shake. I can close my eyes and see the fire flickering against the cracked walls, hear the soft, deliberate whisper of my own name in the dark. The sense of being watched, of being chosen, lingers longer than the memory itself. I cannot explain it, cannot rationalize why a simple, empty cabin would evoke such dread. Perhaps it was the isolation, the exhaustion, or my own imagination stretched thin, but some part of me knows that the whispers were real, that the cabin had a purpose beyond my understanding, and that it may still call out, waiting for the next traveler to stumble blindly into its hollow embrace. I have learned to respect the mountains in a way I never did before, to move carefully, to listen, and to acknowledge that some places are meant to be left alone. But sometimes, in the dead hours of night, when the wind is just right and the house creaks with the weight of old wood, I hear a faint echo of that first whisper, my name carried on the air with soft insistence. It is a sound that reminds me of that night in Widow's Hollow, a night that shaped the way I move through the forest, the way I think about silence, and the way I remember that some places hold memory long after we have left them. The mountains are patient. The cabin was patient. And I will never forget the sound of my name spoken in the dark, deliberate and urgent from a place that should not exist, yet does, quietly, persistently, watching.